Okay, welcome. It's the top of the hour, so in respect for everyone's time, let's go ahead and get started. Ben's running the slides. I'm going to be the MC today. And wow, I was expecting a few more people, but let's get started with this part and people can join in as they show up. We've got a pretty full agenda. Next slide, please. So this is the note well. It's not changed since we met last at IETF 112. This is the responsibilities that anyone who contributes has, so please make sure you have reviewed it before you contribute. Next slide. So please live the IETF Code of Conduct. Let's just be respectful of each other and courteous. And this group has not had problems with that in the past. Let's keep it that way. Next slide. So this is the agenda for today. It was sent to the list a while ago. So let's just go ahead and get started if there are no agenda bashes. Okay, and thank you, Jack. Right before the meeting started on email, you volunteered to take notes. We greatly appreciate it. So I think Chris is going to do the presentation of the first one. Is that right?
John has.
So Russ, did we have an agenda bash? Didn't we have an agenda bash from John on AOB?
Oh, I didn't see that. Is that in chat?
Yeah. No, it was email in advance. Maybe it was in the chat.
John, both email and John has asked for AOB if we have any.
Yeah, if we have any.
And
okay,
just as
so
a preview, I think
you sent the slide deck for short lifetime and OCSP, which we approved, and we'll just handle those during any other business, assuming there's time.
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. It was giving me a thing that I wasn't being heard. And my video looks a little squished, but I guess that's okay. Yeah, so actually there's not a ton of updates. You can go to the next, or wait, no, you're controlling, Ben. I got some comments from Jack specific to the changes from 15 to 16. I think they're all pretty straightforward. It would be good for folks to read it more specifically, but I did agree with the fixes. I did adopt Jack's suggested text for the procedures on JSON pointer digest, and I did move that section. It was in an odd place. I don't know how that happened. It was probably a copy and paste thing or something like that, but I moved it up to the top of section, I think it's 6.1. And I fixed some of the digest example values. So I don't think anything to talk about there. I don't think so. So going back, we haven't had a meeting since these changes. So we added there was some list discussion about it, but in general, the comments that I've heard about adding the new icon key value are all pretty positive, and sort of corresponds to the call info purpose icon, just in general used as a alternative way of doing things. If, I think where it was sort of ending up was that people were just using JCard to provide an image. So we sort of covered that case as one of the more baseline cases and included a specific icon key value. Any comments on that one? Ben? I don't think we're hearing you. Or at least I'm not hearing you. Is anybody else hearing me? Okay. I guess I assume that, yeah.
While you sort that out, could you put it in chat?
Okay. I'll move on unless anyone else has any comments. We can always come back to talk to Ben's comment. Oh, Ben's offline here. Let me share the slides. Oh, I don't know. Can I share slides? I have to ask to share slides. There we go. Okay. Are you back online, Ben? Can you speak or?
I'm back. Am I sharing your slides now, or are you?
I just started sharing slides because it went offline when you disconnected, but we can hear you now. So
I figure, okay. I was going to say I like this change a lot. And the reason I like the change is I was looking at situations where we would want to pre-compute RCDI values. Like maybe you want to put it in a claim constraint or something. And computing RCDI values when you want to do something simple, like just have an image, but then dealing with all the overhead and variability of the JCard, having the order right and things like that, is somewhere between tedious and tricky.
yeah.
So I think this simplifies the use case I see. That'll probably be the first use case you see hitting industry,
Right.
is name, logo, and call reason.
Yep. Yeah, I agreed. It's actually been mentioned for a little while and finally stuck it in at the end. So I think, yeah, most of the comments I've gotten are very positive about this one.
Chris, I'm sorry. What is the bottom line? You're sending it as a file or you're sending it as a URL, the icon?
It's a URI URL. It's essentially defined as a key value where the value is the URL to the image itself. So it follows similar to how the definition of icon is in call info. And we don't say too much more about it. There is discussions about, the formats and other things. And I think we're trying to resolve that in the zip core draft as more general rules that apply to both RCD and call info. Although those are always tricky discussions as well, but we do have some basic guidance.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. The last one, obviously, probably more discussion to be had there. I don't know if folks saw my message to the list last night. I'm sort of admitting that I opened a can of worms that I probably shouldn't have. Although a lot of the discussions going on in the industry right now are sort of relevant to this topic. But I think at the end of the day, maybe the simplest fix is just to revert that paragraph that I inserted, and we can have those discussions as part of other profiles and policy initiatives that happen in other forums. Curious what people think about that. Ben, your hand is up.
I think I agree, and I was going to ask you when you talk about reverting this. I noticed this text in the I can't remember the section number, but the section on putting RCD claims in non-RCD passports that has some fairly prescriptive language there that I think might be part of what needs to be adjusted. But my thoughts is that I think we should explain the consequences of decisions and the trust implications, but we shouldn't be trying to tell the industry what their trust model should be and how they decide who they trust.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I recognize I probably crossed that line a little too far. So I think the replacement that I had was a note that did stay within those bounds, but certainly willing to hear comments. Maybe I should have included that text here, but people can reference it if you have to look at the 14 spec in order to see what was there before. I mean, I think we're probably not going to get consensus on this call, although I would sort of like to say like people are in general agreement, and maybe we can work through that on the list if possible to push things forward if people have any issues with the note as it was in 14. Jack, did you have
Looking at the diff between 14 and 15, it looks like that paragraph was just added in its entirety. There was nothing beforehand.
Oh, okay. I thought I deleted it. Maybe you're right. Is that note still there, or did I delete it? There's a paragraph that starts with note. I'm trying to find it myself. I mean, if that's the case, I don't mind just deleting it.
I'm not sure, but I think the text I mentioned in the section on non-RCD passports was already in 14. It wasn't a change from 14 to 15. I may be mistaken on that point, and I think that's the text that John also referenced in one of his emails.
I was looking in entirely the wrong place. Ignore me.
Yeah, so I have text note. There is one very important caveat to this capability because generally if there's a URI reference content in RCD passport, there's often a requirement to use RCDI claim constraints. So it's important for the user of the specification to recognize that certificates used must include the necessary JWT claims constraints for proper integrity or security of values in the RCD claim incorporated in passports that are not RCD. That's what it says current in 14. And I believe that's the paragraph that I replaced with the new text, which was much more opinionated.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, the issue, and I don't know, Jack, if this is really the way that you're looking at this as well. I think we certainly want to explain what the use case is for using JWT claim constraints in certs, but I don't think we want to cast it, especially at this stage of adoption in the marketplace, in such a way that it comes across like you have to have JWT claim constraints, so you can't do RCD. And like that, the text isn't normative, so I mean, but it's still pretty strongly seems to encourage that to me. And I just think we're going to face, especially as adoption of RCD begins to ramp up, there are going to be use cases where it's absolutely essential to use JWT claim constraints, and these are use cases that involve enterprises and delegation and all that kind of stuff. But then there are going to be, I think, a class of service providers and potentially vetters, if we can use the V word here in the IETF, who probably are not going to be signing RCD with certificates that have JWT claim constraints in them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with that. I think I agree with, as long as we're all on the same page, that my biggest concern is that we shouldn't not say anything that encourages the use of integrity. But yeah, to have any normative language around it, I agree, is not appropriate for at least this spec. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to jump in as a chair and say it sounds like we're all violently agreeing, and it's just a matter of seeing the other text in context to see if people agree on the details.
Yeah, I mean, and I would also separate, the integrity RCDI itself from JWT claim constraints, right? Like, because the value, their values are not, they're linked, but not entirely overlapping.
Mm-hmm. There was some news text that I'm just recalling now that maybe I didn't catch when I did the diff, around the use of RCDI for claim constraints because of hiding privacy information. I think I put that in the security concerns. I think we had general agreement on the list, but I think, that would be one more thing to mention that I want to make sure folks are generally agreeing with as well. Again, I'm not saying that that has to be the case. It's just we're pointing that out as a potential security concern. Like that you have in your JWT claim constraints, you have, essentially not plain text, but in the ASN1, there's plain text RCD claims that could be exposed because certificates are public.
Good thing to note.
But I didn't hear that. Did you say that's good?
I'm sorry, I said, yeah, that's a good thing to note.
Yes, okay. Okay, so what should be the plan? I think, can we work on the list on this? Is this something we want to try to work out on the list and push this forward, or is it going to take another meeting cycle for this? Or I guess that's my question.
All right. Go ahead, Ben, but I don't think there's a need for a whole meeting cycle. Just let's bang out some text.
I was going to hope we don't need another meeting cycle. As that hope always goes, right? We should never need another meeting cycle for anything. But in this case, I really hope we don't need another meeting cycle. Yeah. But the question I have is, has there been enough change since the last working group last call to need another working group last call? And I tend to think we have, even though we've done a bunch of them. And I was going to ask my co-chair's opinion.
So my view is that once we get this discussion closed and another draft posted, -17, we just do a call that says, are there any new issues opened by these changes, or was the fix to your previous issue not adequately resolved? That way it's kind of a closing of the existing last call.
That's reasonable.
I will put out a 17 with the revision. I also got a few typo comments from some Verizon folks as well. I'll include that too. And then maybe people can review. I think that's the cleanest way to have people review the changes, right? Does that work?
Works for me.
Okay. Okay, that's all I had to discuss for this. Is there any other comments? Last minute comments? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think John is up next for connected identity.
So John, do you want to run your slides or do you want me to?
You're welcome to, if they're available. I'm sure it would take me tons of fumbling around to figure out how to make them appear. But does my video look super distressed to everyone else? I look like I'm in an 8-bit video game.
Are you sure you're
It
not?
is a little wobbly for some reason.
I am in an 8-bit video game, it's true.
Maze.
I'm locked in 1984 or so. So yeah, let's talk a bit about connected identities. This is not, this will be a recurring theme in my presentations today. This is not a very substantial update. This is a maintenance update primarily. Next slide. For those of you that have long since forgotten about what we're trying to achieve here, the idea of the connected identity draft is basically that the way we define STIR, because of STIR's problem statement, it's really focused on invites, right? Like that's the only thing that's getting signed practically in deployments out there today. And the issue with that is if there are use cases where it makes sense to be able to sign other messages, we probably need some guidance about how to do that. And in particular, some of the other messages I'm interested in signing include things like buys and updates. And the reason updates in particular are interesting is because they can be used during session establishment to send a new identity in the backwards direction for cases where you were expecting to reach some particular entity, but it turns out you ended up reaching somebody else instead. And this can be surprising, and in cases where the entity you're trying to reach is, say, a financial institution, a healthcare institution, something like that, it might be actually actively bad. And so the main premise of this is to look at work that John Elwell did way back in the day in RFC 4916, which originally kind of defined connected identity, that was based on the original RFC 4474, which first defined the identity header, and explain how we can get basically that mechanism updated to the degree that it needs to be to work with post RFC 8224 STIR. And there are a couple of threat models that actually motivate this, aside from this question of how do I know the person I connected to is actually who they're supposed to be. You know, it's great when you do connect to a bank, for example, to be able to get something back from them, you know, a STIR level assurance that the number you're trying to reach is the number you have in fact connected to. But there are also a set of other things that are just outside of the original STIR threat model, like route hijacking, where somebody manages to connect you not to your bank, or even kind of more arcane things. And this comes from, you know, work and threat models that I'm aware of in the mobile arena, especially around things like short stopping or various attacks where an intermediary tries to tell one side of the call that the call is torn down and tell the other side that the call is still going. And as well, this dovetails with some of the SIP Brandy work that we did on media security and how we can link STIR to media security. A lot of things that turns out kind of need this capability for bilateral authentication between endpoints. Next slide. So what have we done? Well, we made it a working group item, and I was pleased to see that the supporting charter text is now in place that kind of removes some of the shackles that we originally put on the STIR working group. to keep it focused strictly on that impersonation problem. But otherwise, it's a fairly minor revision. Based on our previous discussion, it now punts on conferencing. We talked about what we wanted to do for multi-party cases of this. Those are just like out of scope of this for the moment. And I'll come back to this a bit when we talk about messaging later. But there's a bit more text in there, not much about pre-association and the potential use of directories to determine whether or not someone you're trying to reach supports connected identity or if they should. Especially as this is a new idea, not something with any implementation in the field today. Obviously, you can't have any expectation when you're calling a particular bank that they're going to support all the things you need to support to do this. And, there are a couple of ways potentially to mitigate that. One, of course, would be if there's some way to advertise support for it. You could also do something that's more like trust on first use-ish, right? Where I know in the past, when I connected to this particular bank, they did support connected identity. I'm just going to kind of log that and remember it. And if I try to connect them later and suddenly they don't support it and suddenly I don't know who I'm talking to, maybe I should have some kind of security alerting to the user that there might be mischief afoot. One thing this does desperately need is examples, is to update the examples from RFC 4916. I was kind of surprised, actually, when I was going back through 4916. It doesn't really seem to have an example of connected identity during call setup. It's really kind of focused on getting the initial call done and then kind of renegotiating who it is that you ended up connecting to. So I started mocking up, based on the text I've written previously, what I think some of those examples would look like, but obviously we'll need detailed message breakdowns of both a sunny day case and a rainy day case. The sunny day one just being, I connected to my bank. Great, they send me an update message in the backwards direction, a passport that shows me that in fact I reached the number that I was trying to reach. That's fantastic. And then a rainy day case where I was trying to reach Bob and instead Carol is replying. And at least I have a passport that ensures me that Carol is who I think Carol is. And what I then do with that information and how that factors in is something that obviously is left to local policy and to the, unfortunately, pretty strict constraints, frankly, of what the user experience could be for this, especially when we're talking about, a telephone that you're like holding up to your ear and like, what kind of indication are you supposed to get and how that might work still needs to be articulated a bit. But basically, like I said, this is a maintenance update that kind of moved the ball forward a bit. Next slide. So yeah, I still do have an open action item to put in some more text about privacy and anonymity. And this is kind of an issue in that, if I can, especially using a medialist dialogue, which is one of the things that's discussed for how you might kind of forge a pre-session to ascertain who it is I'm going to be connecting to, and then choose to elevate that with updates into like a real SIP session with media and so on. That could be used to like probe in ways that might reveal information that we don't want to reveal. And so there probably needs to be some guidance in there, at least about what we think the potential privacy risk is in that. It may be that people don't particularly want you to know who you're going to be reaching when you call this number. Obviously, since this is an optional feature, they could always choose not to share connected identity in the backwards direction if they thought that they didn't want to reveal who they were. But nonetheless, just automated systems that are doing this could end up shedding data that we don't want shed. So we need some privacy security text to wrap around that. I've kind of gone back and forth over the years of whether I think this is really a BIS of 4916, and I think it's not, in the sense of the stuff that 4916 actually defines. I don't think we're modifying so much as explaining how it applies or could be reapplied to what is in 8224 as opposed to RC 4474. And definitely the examples need to reflect all this. Like that stuff will totally be updated because the old examples have identity info headers in them and a bunch of other stuff that we have long since jettisoned. But unless people here feel strongly about this, and I think I probably have raised this before in previous meetings, like I think I'm comfortable with this kind of just being like an update, as I said, rather than a formal BIS that is intended to obsolete 4916. But, you know, if people feel strongly about that, they're welcome to weigh in. But that's about it on this one. Like I said, there's stuff still to do. I still think we need this. It's not in my super pressing category of things that we need. So, you know, it's not on a front burner of mine at the moment, but definitely I think more review, energy, interest, all that stuff would be welcome and needed. Next slide. So yeah, I think that would be the end of what I have to say about connected identity, unless there are any further comments, questions, and so on. I should read the chat.
I don't see anybody jumping in the queue line. Go ahead, Chris.
I'm already co-author of this document, but I will say that, you know, especially if we can get an RCD done, I will definitely spend more time on this document.
All righty, next up.
Okay, the next one is the identity header error handling. I think Chris is doing that one, right?
Yeah, this one should hopefully be short. There's really not too many changes. I think we were sort of pretty much in agreement on most of the content before. You can go to the next slide. I did include the specific reference to Robert's draft and a few, I think there are only editorial updates. Robert, did you want to say something?
So now that you've made that reference, and I think this is the only reference to the document, that document still needs to go through SIPCORE, I suppose. Does it need to wait for anything, or do we tell PushCore to go ahead and publish it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. So I think we can just, and I think it has everything we need. So I think we're good.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Thank you for doing that. I did add some basic security considerations just to put that in there, but somewhat repeats some of the, in particular, the privacy consideration of making sure that you strip the passport if you use that as an ID to reference the passport that has an error going back. So just reinforcing that, I guess. Other than that, go, Jack, you have a comment?
Hey, so I vaguely recall having a discussion about the fact that that security consideration to strip wasn't actually enough, and that we probably need an extra security consideration saying that if you value your privacy, you need to use the compact form rather than the full form, because intermediate the intermediate diverting entities might not understand this, might not have implemented this, and so won't strip their information, and therefore they will just happily pass it back and I'll private information.
I'll include something that says that in the security considerations. That's a good point. We do have that defined in the document, actually, but yeah, I can add a paragraph to mention that in security considerations. Thank you.
So does anyone think this is not ready for working group last call after that -02 is posted?
Yeah, and I can go ahead and just do that also very quickly in the next few days. If that's the only comment.
Okay, I'm not hearing anyone think that's a bad idea. So that's what we'll plan for.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, next up is out-of-band STIR for service providers. John?
Apologies, I don't seem to have that one preloaded. Give me just a second and I'll get the slide deck up, but it may take a couple of seconds here.
That wasn't me.
Sorry, Siamese cat, this board.
A new deck is being shared. Pretty cool. Okay. So next slide, let's talk about out of band. And out of band no longer considered as a web service within the original threat model of RFC 8816. So this draft is back, as I say, after a brief absence. This is something that, for me is motivated by a couple of use cases I'm aware of, mostly in the international space, where some nations or systems are not optimistic about making an IP transition entirely anytime soon, but are nonetheless trying to realize some of the value of STIR-shaken with something like the certificate architecture that allocates certificates to service providers in a roughly shaken-like way, but that they would have the ability to access what we call a call placement service in 8816 to store and retrieve passports such that potentially you can circumvent the amount of PSTN or potentially even IP that just simply is not going to send passports end to end that might be between a couple of service providers. And the bit of sleight of hand we did that alters the original RFC 8816 threat model was that, since really RFC 8816 was focused on preventing data collection at the CPS when it's operated as a third-party service, what we kind of assume for the purposes of the service provider OOB draft is that the CPS is not a monolithic centralized entity, but is rather something that is operated on behalf of service providers specifically who are going to see the PSTN signaling anyway. And so like any information that we're sending in like a bare passport is really redundant with signaling information they're probably going to receive. Now, we say that it's either operated by one of these CSPs or is operated on their behalf. Either way, kind of contractually, the assumption is that we're no longer as concerned about the data collection model. And so, like I said, this is descriptive of kind of emerging efforts that I see in a couple of places to do this. Obviously, there is a spec in Addis, which Alec, who I believe is on the line, wrote, that looks at kind of the more gatewaying specific case, and especially kind of looks at like, okay, we have an IP and an I here in the United States, and there's going to be some bits of PSTN that sort of hang off of it. Is there a way that we can like make this work for that as like a gatewaying function? This is looking much more broadly at if you have an ecosystem of players who don't have an IP and an I between them necessarily, like, what are their prospects to be able to use a CPS? So next slide. Once again, this is a brief maintenance update. So really, for example, the things that are significant open issues in this are about what the interfaces are that service providers would utilize to access the CPS. Right now, I'm basically pointing to RFC 8816 and saying there is a REST interface defined in that. That's the REST interface that we propose using. The security for that is, of course, based on the possession of STIR certificates that are, used when storing or retrieving passports, to restrict it just to that community of service providers that are interacting with the CPS. Now, the issue is 8816 is, of course, informational. This document has aimed for PS from its inception. If you look back politically, historically, like RFC 8816 was made informational because people weren't very comfortable with out-of-band overall at the time. I think there has been a bit of a tectonic shift around that in the way that people are looking at out-of-band. And as a consequence, I would just eat the downref, to be blunt. I mean, we could just copy that passage out of 8816 and put some more normativity into it and have that be in this document. But I mean, this is something, I guess, question for the chairs and for anybody IETF process-wise wants to comment. I would just eat the downref if nobody says otherwise.
As a chair, I'll say the important bit is convincing the ADs.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty easy sell because, I mean, there is enough of an API specified in 8816 that, I mean, I think it could have been PS, right? If we just, chose to push it that way. Russ, any comments?
Well, or we just call out the downref in the IETF last call, and it goes forward anyway.
Yeah, that's what I suggest. That's what I'm suggesting here. Yeah, it's a downref. We would call it out as normal and just say, look, we're using that interface. It's in that, and it's a downref. Okay, I'm content to do that if we think the ADs won't barf on it. In terms of the other aspect of this, there's kind of two models by which we imagine service providers might interact with the CPS in this, a push and a pull model. And this is really, for the terminating service provider perspective and the originating one. In the push model, there's an assumption that because the CPS is effectively acting on behalf of a particular service provider, any passports that are pushed to it can just be pushed down to the terminating service provider's OBVS. And the OBVS doesn't need to wait for a call to come in and be like, oh, I need to go ask the CPS for any passports that might exist for this call and get them back. That just seems like a recipe for the introduction of additional latency and needless RTTs. And I kind of went back and forth as we've been working on this of how much I wanted to specify that push interface, in part because it's easy for me to imagine models where the CPS and the OBVS are effectively, the same entity. Right. And because the CPS exists for the purpose of receiving, if we imagine it as scoped to the terminating service provider's, interests, then it exists for no other purpose than to receive passports that are supposed to go to that OBVS. The only part where this gets a little hairy is cases where we imagine there's more of a service that is acting on behalf of a number of potential terminating service providers. And then you need some kind of discriminator that's going to figure out, okay, I'm going to push this passport to service provider A, whereas this passport goes to service provider B. And we could specify a whole subscription notification interface, right, between OBVSs and CPSs, where you say exactly what resource it is you want to subscribe to. But as the fine print in the bullet down there, the third bullet from the bottom suggests, this runs us into the classic problem of a lot of these service provider deployments use something like service provider codes, and figuring out which telephone numbers are associated with which of those codes is kind of a known problem. Some kind of external database needs to tell you that. And, I suspect that logic will end up living more in places like that than in, okay, I'm going to figure out a way to describe to do a subscription that is going to specify every number in this list. I'm going to push this to the CPS, and how the point is the CPS would still need to authorize that list and vet that it's correct against said database anyway. And so rather than specifying that, my proposal is we basically punt on it and just say, look, if such push interfaces exist that are not cases where the CPS and the OBVS are literally coupled, then like it's probably going to end up being policy on the part of the CPS how it ascertains which passport it's going to send to which service providers that it serves. And I think we scope it this way, this document can advance faster, like, because, you know, the more I looked at it, the less I actually want to go to the hassle of defining that subscription interface when I think it's actually pretty much inert in terms of what the CPS would practically do to figure out how it's going to distribute passports. Anybody want to push back on that or have a better idea? Because like that seems to be the reality on the ground for me of how this would work. Alec.
Yeah. So we built one of these actually, and I really liked it. But for other reasons, we changed it. But basically, I think so. I think you hit the nail on the head. You're when it's coupled, it's a lot easier. But the trick that we found, create the service that's multi-tenanted but totally isolated, so you're not figuring out which one it is. And the way we basically did it is you had a prefix in a tenant URL, and so when you want to publish something into the CPS, the URL is / service provider unique ID, and then / telephone number, and then the service provider can subscribe. And they're only allowed to subscribe to things within their unique ID. They could subscribe to their entire unique ID or even specific numbers, prefixes of numbers within their unique ID. But they're scoped to their ID. So it's kind of like a coupling, but then it's multi-tenanted, so it's separate. It worked really well. It was really cool because you could, and it was push. It's fast, much faster than retrieving. I mean, retrieving is fast, but it was, we beat the call every time. Every time it was way before the call. I mean, it wasn't even close. TDM is so slow.
Yeah, no, I believe it. Yeah, I mean, that's another great example. Like anything that just prefixes the URL or uses URL declaration in some form to differentiate which terminating service provider you are targeting with the CPS push, like I think makes this pretty trivial. I mean, my question is just how much value do you get out of the TSP being able to subscribe to some subset of the passports that are supposed to go to it? Because if there's like real value in that, then there might be value in specifying a subscription interface. I just couldn't figure out what the value, if any, there was.
We created it so that it was multi-tenanted. So the terminating service provider could give credentials to their enterprise and then let the enterprise, and the terminating service provider was all using PKI. So actually we didn't even maintain credentials. It was really nice. But the enterprise could be giving credentials signed by the terminating service provider that scoped them to a specific set of numbers, and then they could subscribe and receive those directly.
Okay, yeah. Anything where there's like another layer of indirection on the other side of the TSP, I agree. There's probably a need for some kind of a discriminator to send it to different places. But you couldn't get that into the URL itself?
They wouldn't know. And so then this is where the problem we had with the with that model in the first place was, right? The person publishing has to know your service, your unique ID. And then you kind of defeat, you're shifting the problem of the CPS having to know who it belongs to the OSP having to know who, or whoever's publishing it, to having to know they have to put the right URL in there. And how do they know what the URL is? All they know is I'm sending a call to this phone number. So you could just shift it where the problem is.
So it's, well, but there is a bit of service provider or CPS discovery text that's in this document. And there are a couple of ways to skin that cat, right? And like my favorite is, of course, to just bake the CPS's URL into the cert. And so in a case we're using like delegation enterprises, like the enterprise cert would actually have this. But that basically, I mean, I understand that just transposes this into a certificate discovery problem, but I actually like that problem more because we already have a network of STICRs, right? Like it's their job to give these certs out. So like, I think there's a couple ways to skin that. But I think I do want to think some more about that question of if there are, multiple entities behind the TSP effectively that's being shared out to, what the implications of that would be for this. Yeah.
One comment, we use something called NATS as the client. It's a open source system, but the point is, I guess, I don't know that you would necessarily want to define a formal push mechanism, like the semantic. You know, people may want to leverage there's a lot of pub subsystems out there. Maybe people want to use, you know, pub subsystems. We didn't build our own pub subsystem. We used an existing one that has its own internal protocol that it uses and supports PKI based authentication. Everything would work perfectly for this. So just one comment, you know, I think maybe as an example, but maybe not as a normative, this is the only way you can do pub sub, because that's a lot of code to write when there's a lot of open source libraries out there that do pub sub.
Yeah, agreed. The reinventing that wheel for the millionth time is the last thing the STIR working group should be doing. So yeah, so my pitch here is that we're punting on the push interface. That's where I started on this.
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else on this? Anybody want to go to bat for let's invent yet another push interface, or have a beauty contest to specify this should be the one and only push interface we use, or whatever?
100% agreement that we should not define a new push interface, and we should either make it abstract or something that allows people to use existing solutions that are battle tested, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so that's like the main stuff that I did. I also added some security considerations, just trying to capture what I think the slight differences are between the security model here and the RC 8816 model. So next slide. You know, I mean, if everybody's cool with that, this might really be nearing its final form. You know, if we're aiming this for PS, I think I probably want to go through and sprinkle in some musts and shoulds and places that are, but they probably belong, that there aren't now. But like, otherwise, I think this is good for some serious review. And like, if anybody has any interventions or thoughts or other places we should take it, glad to talk about them, but this might be getting close. Jack.
So something I kind of missed as you were going through the slides is the API for pulling the passports from 8816, 8816. Would that be normative as an API, or is it just a suggested, this is what it could look like?
That's a really good question. I mean, it's kind of your job when you're doing this as PS to be normative if you can be, but I don't think we'd want that to be exclusive. No, I think we want to have a representation of the architecture that is clear what the security properties are, and then be able to point to 8816 and say, like, you know, this is a standard way to do that, right? And like, I don't think we want to say that there is no other possible API for this but that one. So I think I might, you know, there's a traditional dodge used in the IETF, which is we say something is mandatory to implement, but not mandatory to use. I might say that implementations that are compliant with this specification, it would be mandatory to implement that, but that, because it's just REST, right? I mean, it's like bare REST. Like, it's not something that, you know, is a pretty heavy lift for anyone, but not mandatory to use, so that alternatives could be used. Would that assuage any concerns?
Yes, I was basically asking just how heavily should I go back and review that API?
I mean, it could use some review, to be honest, because again, like, you know, this was not scrutinized anything like this now is going to require, given who's interested in doing this at this point. So like, yeah, please do, Jack. It just is a personal favor to me. Please go back and look at it. But that much, I mean, it's just like REST stuff. Right? It's not like, I don't think there's any hidden magic in there.
Yeah, cool.
Ben?
So I'm going to pull the usual. I haven't had a chance to read the most recent update, but I have a comment about it anyway.
Sure.
But the one thing I would like people to do is think really hard about the security considerations, and because this came up in some of the ADIS discussions, and mainly those are referring out to security considerations in the the big out-of-band RFC around the potential for replay attacks. And just think about, is there anything else we need to say here that we haven't said? I don't know that there is. I'm not suggesting there is, but I think we need to make sure that people think about that when they look at this.
Yeah, I think I did even introduce some new text about the substitution attack, which is the only one that anyone seems to care about in this. Again, my party line on the substitution attack for a long time has been pretty clear, I think, that I don't think it's a problem for impersonation use cases like we consider for robocalling, right? Where the problem is bulk unsolicited commercial communications. The replay attack is more interesting when we're looking at like fraud use cases. So the kind of stuff I was talking about in my connected identity presentation, like those are places where there's a targeted entity that you're trying to impersonate, anything that's more like the voicemail hacking attack. Like these are cases where I care more about, because it might be worth your time to try to win that race. Like in that case, I don't think it's worth your time to try the substitution attack if you're placing 100,000 calls a second from your spam service. I don't think it makes sense for any number of reasons. But like, in the end of the day, and Ecker and I went around this, maypole endlessly when this OOB first started up. Like it's a pretty dangerous, there's a lot of exposure in launching that substitution attack. Like it's pretty obvious that you tried to do it. And like the kind of powers you need to have to launch it successfully are pretty extreme. Now there are cases, again, where there's a lot of money at stake, or where you're a state actor or something, where that stuff worries me. But yeah, it doesn't worry me for the vast majority of what STIR has traditionally been concerned with. As we get more into kind of fraud cases, I maybe get a little more worried about the substitution attack. But your advice is well taken, Ben. And honestly, I can't understand why you didn't have time to read this draft. Seriously, this has been out for at least 15 hours and you haven't read it. Like, what is the IETF coming to? Anyway, Chris.
I was just going to make a comment relative to the API stuff. I think the problem for me using REST as a interoperable protocol is when you get to things like authentication and other parts, it sort of breaks. And there's probably a few other dimensions that I'm not even thinking of off the top of my head. So even though it looks simple from the beginning, to fit it in a framework that people are authenticated and other things like that, it sort of breaks down. So I'm not a big fan of standardizing APIs from that perspective, but that's my personal feeling.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I mean, the intention in the service provider OB draft is that your authentication is based on your STIR credentials, right? And like that's the price of admission of dealing with a CPS. And so hopefully that obviates some of it, but is there something more specific that you're concerned about with authentication?
If it's that straightforward, if like the request is signed somehow, or I'm not that I would have to look back at the draft how it works. But as long as it's a common way of doing it, and people don't have to build other things around it, which won't be interoperable, then that's a better situation. Like Acme is a good example.
What's in the draft now?
Authentication framework for that. Go ahead, sorry.
What's in the draft now is Alex's personal favorite, which is using mutual TLS, right? So that actually your HTTPS connection is just like secured by TLS from, based on your STIR cert. I know Alec hates it, which is why I'm saying it's his favorite. But, and I mean, I think that, there are alternatives to that. Like, the Addis approach uses signing a token instead. I mean, just signing a passport basically, right? And so, I mean, there are alternative ways to bootstrap the, the STIR certificates into the security association with the HTTP server. But like, I think the most IETF-ish way would be to just say use mutual TLS, just have the TLS be where that's rooted.
Yeah, maybe that can work. But yeah, just my opinion and just a comment.
Okay, Alec, Yeah, sorry. And please feel free to correct me if I'm misrepresenting you on that one. But yes, what's up, man?
No, completely agree. I'm not a fan of mutual TLS. Just in practice, I find it can be difficult in public services. But one comment I had, kind of going back to the previous comment about the replay attacks, that I don't know if you're familiar with the ATIS 10095 kind of UUI, putting passports in a UUI coded in a special way to make them fit. But that idea got me a little bit thinking about, what if we could put something in maybe the UUI or maybe somewhere else in the TDM, kind of like some unique identifier that maybe could help to then, when we get to the other side, right, you can have that identifier and say, okay, yeah, this is really the right call. Now it's got to make it to the other end, which can be a challenge. But the UUI could be a good option that looks like maybe that's got a high probability of making it to the other end.
Yeah, so I'm aware of these, and maybe for those that aren't following the other stuff, this is we're talking ISUP here, ISUP UUI.
Yes.
You know, I guess the prospects I have for ISUP or Q931, like actually being changed enough to permit this to go through, I personally don't think the prospects of that are very good. I mean, I'd be interested to hear from people that think, you know, we can upgrade the SS7 network. I think it's been kind of a, you know, a talking point, maybe a canard for the last like 10 years, that just it's not feasible to upgrade that network in any way that would result in like end-to-end stuff working between discrete service provider environments. So like I'm certainly not opposed to it in principle, and I agree. We've talked about as well about like in-band media indications. Like there are all kinds of ways you can try to get some additional signal through the PSTN channel that would mitigate those substitution attacks. I'm just not that worried about the substitution attacks, I guess. I think it's prohibitively difficult to launch, and it's like super detectable. It's super hard to win, and like you need like really good powers to be able to figure out how to do it. Like powers that involve like compromising call processing systems so that you can like tell calls are in progress that you're in a race against. Like, you know, apart from some of those baiting attacks, and I don't really think that baiting attacks are feasible for most scenarios. You know, I'll put it this way. I think it's more feasible to defeat this through just like implementing reasonable security best practices around things like that than like changing ISUP. Right. I guess Alec first, and then Ben again. Yeah.
Ben, I don't know. Maybe Ben, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I don't.
If you're going to exactly respond to, if you're going to respond directly to what he just said, go ahead.
So I agree. I guess so. I was actually kind of thinking of this from a couple ways. So one, yeah, the replay, some identifier that could be beneficial. I agree. I think that's very challenging to do in practice, certainly for the robocall use case. I really agree with kind of everything there, but I think maybe there's a second way to look at it that could be helpful. The CPS discovery is a major problem, right? Not to say it doesn't have solutions, but it can be a problem. It can be challenging. One thing I was looking at was, what if we just put a URL in the UUI of ISUP signaling, and that URL is the call placement services URL. There's no longer I need to know which URL. It's no longer this. It's no longer the TSPs, or I say TSP. It's no longer the provider converting it back to SIP or the TSP, whichever the case is. It's actually the OSP, or the provider converting it to TDM. It's their call placement service. And so they're going to put it in their call placement service. Basically, when you convert a call to TDM, you make it the passport available in the CPS, and then you put in this ISUP signaling, here's how you go get it. It's really very similar to 95, where you're using ISUP signaling, but 95 tries to put everything in the ISUP signaling, and that works for cases where you have so little information that it fits. But as soon as you have too much information, it doesn't fit anymore, and you start losing things. And if instead you just put a URL, you could have 20 passports. It doesn't matter. It's just a URL, and that URL is going to have some random string. So you've not only dealt with the replay, you also now don't have to distribute passports between different call placement services. You've dealt with discovery. You've kind of dealt with everything. So that's something I'm kind of looking at, and I might be submitting a contribution in NIPCA for, just so everybody's aware.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Maybe we should talk more about it offline. I mean, you know, I think there are hard edges around that. And again, a lot of it comes down to exactly who we expect, what the relationship is between the gateway that is both, you know, doing IP to PSTN and PSTN to IP, and the OSP and the TSP. And like a lot of this comes down to how you stage the CPS to meet the security principles that we're trying to achieve with this draft, right? Which are not allowing third parties to be the operators of CPSs. And like, you know, unless they're specifically, again, contracted to the either the OSP or the TSP. And like how, you know, because if what's happening is there's like a yard of PSTN that calls go through somewhere in the middle in transit networks that has no relationship to the OSP or TSP, that gets much harder for me from a security perspective. But like, you know, that doesn't mean it's not solvable. Like if you imagine, for example, that your URL, the URL of the CPS was like already in something that is being carried like with the passport as it's traveling, and like that just gets to go into the UI and like, you know, is perceptible to the TSP when it arrives. Like there are ways that could help. Yeah, definitely.
And just, I'm thinking this is operated by the provider converting the call to TDM. So any privacy concerns really don't exist because the provider, I mean, they have the signaling, they have the identity header, they're making it accessible to the person downstream. But they already have it. And yes, maybe they outsource their call placement service to a third party, but maybe they outsource their authentication to a third party, verification and all that. I mean, so it's all there's no third party that wasn't contractually asked to do something that has access to anything, and anyone who has access to it already had access to the passports and the SIP signaling or TDM signaling and everything. So kind of, again, avoiding the privacy. I agree with what you're saying about that.
I mean, I guess at a high level, I'd say probably this isn't something, you know, figuring out how to stuff something into UI is probably not what we're going to do in the ITF, right? So like maybe that, you know, as an IPCA thing, that's cool, but I doubt that would end up being in the scope of this document and this work here, even if it does end up helping it in the long term.
Yeah, I kind of figured.
Okay, Ben, you've been waiting for a while.
So that conversation was very specific to TDM interconnects. And so is the NIPCA use case is very specific to TDM interconnects. But it made me think about, are there ways, you know, I think at a high level, what we're talking about is adding some extra information to the signaling to bind the passport to avoid the substitution attack. You know, so you're binding on more than just the from and to numbers. And I know this is futile to talk about putting something in SIP for this, you know, because anything you put in SIP gets stripped by the very sort of people you want to not strip your passports. But I've heard, you know, people speculate on other use cases about a ban. For example, I'm just mentioning, maybe you've got this SIP interconnect that's still using UDP and can't handle fragmentation. So you pretty much can't send passports or identity headers. And if you had some extra SIP header that they would somehow be trusted not to mess with, that could be used to help bind that passport to the other end. And I know that that's futile. And then also I've heard some speculation, and I think it's even mentioned in your messaging draft, about potentially using out of band in the messaging cases. I can't remember if you mentioned that or not. Yeah. And it strikes me in that particular case, subject to all the caveats about whether the message integrity feature for messaging passports works at all, that possibly maybe that message integrity piece could serve as additional binding. At least you would get down to the point where you could only replay identical messages instead of a substitution attack.
Yeah, and for messaging, that's the goal, right? Is to make it so all you can replay is identical messages. And since the passports have a timestamp, like they'll show up in your UI's timeline as a dupe, right? Like, provided, you know, your inbox experience is like halfway decent. But yeah, it is important to note. I mean, I don't talk about OOB either here or in 8816 is something specific to the TDM problem. I think the TDM problem is like super interesting, but like there are a lot of reasons passports don't get end-to-end. It's not, policy is probably the number one, right? And so like, you know, even if we get past all the SPCs that just strip everything and so on, it's really policy that is the, I think the, you know, is something at least that I want this to address if it can. And like, so yeah, I share your pessimism about being able to do anything practical in SIP that would be conveyed end-to-end in environments where that stripping is occurring either due to malice or incompetence, right? Like if the passport isn't going to survive, I can't imagine anything else that's going to survive that we would be able to tunnel as like a the secret indicator. It reminds me, you know, the solid people. Remember that solid thing? It's one of Sir Timothy's projects. You know, they had their proposal for how to do STIR together with solid. And part of the way that it worked is you would put in like a phony calling party number. And that's actually what you're tunneling, because there's this like resolution service that the terminating side would use to transform that phony number into the URL of the place where your passport lives. And like you can certainly get like steganographic like that about this if you want to go, you know, totally over the top. But there were a number of reasons why I think that was a bad idea in STIR Solid, and I'm not sure I want to, you know, really scrape the bottom of the barrel for ways that we can like tunnel information through any of these signaling protocols. It may turn out there's something useful we can do with UUI or something like that that'll abet this, but like I think probably whatever that is, it's going to end up being out of scope of the IETF work anyway. Jack?
So this doesn't work for kind of obvious reasons, but we already have a mechanism to do this. We have media key, which obviously doesn't work because PSTN, TADM, all of that stuff, just like you can't do TLS over that. But the idea of that is to tie the signaling to the passports. And in fact, if you don't do that and you're using and you're in like a pure SIP, everything makes it all the way through, there are still ways to impersonate people using div and things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that like tying the signaling to the passports is basically necessary for this to work. Just like any of it.
Yeah, I guess.
And
I mean, I'm kind of not sure what your meta point is there. Like what?
I guess I'm saying it like this isn't a particularly new problem in a way. The fact that signaling needs to be tied to the passport has been a problem for a while now and wouldn't be added by, isn't exactly new with OOB.
No, agreed. Yeah.
But I'm not convinced that that's a good situation to be in.
I mean, again, for the purposes of defeating these robocalling attacks, which is where we started from in this, right? Like, I think it helps in the sense that, you know, if it's just a hassle to impersonate people, and we make that cost more than the money you make from your unsolicited bulk commercial communications, then we may drive you out of business. Like that's been the play from the start here, right? Now we're in the extra credit realm. Well, I guess OOB is still in the original realm, like connected identity and messaging, that's in the extra credit realm. OOB is about like, how can we score more wins, like, you know, with something that we think will take unsophisticated adversaries, people that just cannot launch that substitution attack, off the table or make it more expensive for them to do it, right? And like, I mean, that's been my pitch on this from the start, is that, you know, something like OOB, it ain't perfect. The substitution attack is an issue, but like what you actually have to do to like win those races, what you have to know to win those races, and the degree of exposure you create for yourself as an actor in, you know, the deployment by trying to win that race, those are not risks that the kind of people doing bulk unsolicited commercial communications are willing to take, and they're expensive risks. And like, so for me, this is all gravy, right? This just, you know, takes deficiencies that, as you point out, are endemic to SIP to start with. And like, you know, it may seem like it makes them like a little bit worse, but practically speaking, based on the kind of adversary we're trying to eliminate, I think they actually add a ton of value. Well, I would love more comments like this about the service provider out-of-band document and its prospects. But I would ask the chair, as we start looking towards, maybe we should try to wrap this one up and put a bow on it.
Okay, John, do you think there's a next version based on these comments, or should we working group last call this one?
Yeah, let me take one more spin. Honestly, I just do want to like pixie dust in some musts and shoulds and stuff. I'm serious. before it gets working with last call. So let me do one more spin.
Okay, let's do that.
And one comment I'll make there is, I was joking earlier about not having read the draft, but it hasn't been out there very long. So I'm sure I'm not the only one that hasn't. So before we say it's ready for working group last call, we might give people a chance to read it.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Probably true for most of today's drafts. So, but that's as much the chair's fault as anyone else.
I mean, I submitted like 5 drafts yesterday. Is my recollection. So, and not exactly first thing in the morning either. So yeah. So what's next?
Is messaging.
That's me again. Messaging. Next slide. Next slide. And okay. So for those of you that have forgotten about this one, this is looking at trying to leverage all the great credential infrastructure and smarts that we have generated through STIR to apply to messaging, specifically to messaging where telephone numbers are used as identifiers. For right now, we are kind of keeping the scope to that, although pretty artificially, to be honest. And yes, we all know message spam is a problem. I understand from the chat that, Ben, you got some MMS spam while we were in session, which is awesome. I get a ton these days. I think I get more text spam than I get call spam at this point, which was not true when I started working on this stuff. Well, I started working on this stuff a long time ago, but it was not true even like 5 years ago. And, you know, the basic premise here is, look, if somebody needs to provide a system that is going to securely attest that the sender of a message has the following telephone number, like they should be using STIR credentials to do that. If they aren't, like we all did something wrong, because there's like a ton of these credentials out there for the relevant service providers, and like it would just be crazy if we couldn't make this work. Next slide. There are 2 paths identified in the document. There's really an Sdp Negotiated Path, which looks like RCS. Would be most familiar in the messaging space around this. Could be applicable to RCS. But basically, anything that's negotiating a session with an invite, STIR, we should just get it for free, right? It should just like work with STIR for the most part. Or if it didn't, we did something phenomenally wrong with what we did with STIR in the first place. The second path is, of course, the use of individual messages, like for the message method. I don't believe Brian Rosen is with us today. At least I don't see him in the log, but he's been a big advocate for this for emergency services in particular. Apparently they really need this for some of these applications, and he more or less persuaded me that we should try to specify this here. We've been looking at it as of maybe 1 or 2 revs ago at the MIME level. Really avoiding worrying about creating specific profiles for specific MIME types. Now, as Ben pointed out in the list, and I'll talk about the next slide, of course, signing entire MIME bodies has its own legacy of issues that those of us familiar with SIP have long combated in SMIME and elsewhere. You know, I think basically, though, this can stand as an initial, you know, proposed model for how we're going to approach this, with a couple of caveats that I added in. So next slide. So what is actually new here? I added some text on freshness, and this came from Ben's comments on the list. Ben rightfully pointed out that STIR passport expiry timers, as we recommend from 8224 onwards, at around 60 seconds at the most, probably are not adequate for a lot of these store and forward sorts of potential messaging delivery ecosystems that exist out there. If I just got off a plane and this message has been waiting for me for the last 6 hours, and suddenly I turn my phone on, like, what happens then? I think what the text I added effectively says is, look, passports have timestamps, and message systems can like peg, your message to the time that it was sent. And like, I don't think there's like a replay attack or something like that, or even much opportunity for confusion, as long as the user has an inbox experience on their device that takes into account the fact that, yes, this message was sent at this particular time. There was a date header in the SIP message method that carried it, and there is an IT in the passport, and those are correlated, and this should like work theoretically. Ben, do you want to comment on this one?
No, well, I do want to comment, but what you're saying sounds good to me, and there's an assumption in there that we might want to document that is suggesting that this verification is done as close to the recipient as possible. Because another potential approach to this would say, your message store verifies when things come in, and that way you don't have this delay. But then you have added a additional step and a lack of end-to-endness, which is not ideal if you do it that way. Then the other kind of related comment I was going to say, it's not necessarily just a 6 hour because you were on a plane. If you go look at any messaging app, you can see messages from years ago, message histories and such. And I don't know if we want to say anything about that, but it kind of seems to me that there's a difference between you haven't seen the message yet and you want to see it verified versus I'm going to look at my message history next year and see still see the verification. And again, I don't know if there's anything we need to say about that. I don't know if these applications are going to want to keep a passport store so they can go back and look at them versus just mark everything as verified in your storage. But place it might make a difference is when you have multiple devices and things using the same history storage.
Yeah. I mean, and certainly I'm aware there are message inbox experiences that are just terrible in this regard, right? Where that when you get off the plane, that message appears like the timestamp on it in your UI is right now, when in fact it was, delivered 6 hours ago. And so, this isn't something that I'm trying to sweep under the rug. I mean, I think there's even some text in the draft that basically says, if your inbox experience does not support this, like, you need to treat expiry timers much more seriously, right? Like, but your other point about, do we want this to be like a forensic non-repudiation tool, is an interesting one. Obviously, my philosophy on this from the start has been all these messages, passport should go, to end devices as much as possible. That is the best security story all around for everything that we're trying to achieve on this. But, we live in a world where things are just much more mediated, and it probably is worth documenting that specific case that you were discussing, where it really is like some kind of inbox service that is going to consume these passports and that is responsible for rendering what the user's inbox experience looks like. So the user will not have that forensic capability themselves, right? Like potentially, though, a service could log what the passports were that were associated with these messages at the time they appeared, and those could live with those messages forever. I think we can probably say some non-normative, explanatory material about all this that fleshes that out a bit more, if it'd be helpful. Probably what we can't do is offer much, you got to do it this way around any of that. Chris?
So real quick before we go to Chris, I saw Norbert jump in the queue and drop out like 2 or 3 times. So I don't know if he's having some trouble with the queue or not. Or if someone was just playing with UI.
No, it was just a comment on the backlog, like when you look at your texts that have been received in the past. I think if you front end it and hit that verified, the services should be able to just drop off everything else and just state this is verified in the past. I can't imagine you would need a backlog of, I need to verify this. I mean, what kind of a, past message? I don't know. Sorry. It just,
You said you were going to send me this baseball card 6 months ago, and I haven't gotten it yet. Here's your text that says that, like, I forgot my baseball card, man.
Yeah, I mean, and that's my point, is that both sides generally keep their own version of the text backlog. So I was trying to figure out how, because they, once you receive, it's no longer linked. Yeah. I was just trying to figure out how that would even.
The point here is that the message and the passport, if they coexisted in the end user's inbox, right? Because the passport has this hash over the message content, it is actually a non-repudiable proof that the message content existed at that time and said what it did. And so if you had it, you would be able to tell your friend, you said you got the $500, where's my baseball card?
Okay.
I mean, like I said, I don't think that's particularly realistic, because I believe these things will be terminated as security associations in the network, 99% of the time. But in an ideal world, it would all just go to the end device.
Right. That That was my other thought, is that, how often is it send receive or store send, as opposed to end system, the system that's closest having stored and then displayed, like, when you're getting off a plane.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh,
okay. No worries.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think we need both. I think on the store and forward, I mean, I think all messaging protocols end up being store and forward, right? Or, well, I shouldn't say all, but all the mainstream ones at least. And we have the complication that, with MSRP, it's session based. With message, it's message based. With RTT, it's actually character based. But ultimately, there has to be some stored forward mechanism. I think, there could be some mix of verification at the store and forward, but I think a bigger topic also, which I think we're touching on, but is probably relevant not only to messaging, but voice, is more the operational aspect of, like, how are people keeping passports and certificates in CDRs? And that's something there's been sort of some background conversations, I think, but we really don't have a formal recommendation, whether it's IETF or other forums, for those things. But I do think those are important for multiple reasons, including forensic non-repudiation or other things like that. But that's a bigger comment than this draft, but relevant to it as well. So I think we should take both of those things into consideration.
It would be interesting, actually, to look separately at what we think the forensic obligation is that people take on as VSs, especially. There could be a best practice or something in that we could look at. Yeah. Alec?
Relevant to traceback and other things, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Alec.
I was just going to say the only comment, so like in your example, the baseball card, I shaken passports may not be that useful for that, right? That means that number sent it to you, but not that person. It's almost like if you're using this for non-repudiation, you want this, what if you have a phone number and you send a message and then the number gets assigned to somebody else? I think without some distinction of, like, this number's changed, it's not the same person. I don't know how useful it is to the end user. I don't know that they care if I got a text message from this number. I think they care I got a text message from this person, if you're talking non-repudiation.
Yeah, I mean, no, I hear you. I mean, so there will be cases where it won't be perfect. I think it's pretty good. A lot of people's telephone numbers don't change that frequently. Mine hasn't changed since 2006. So, like, there's an XKCD about that, right? Like, how you understand what a telephone number is, how to read it, like, the first 3 digits where you lived in 2006.
Yeah.
but you know, the you know, I do think the way that inboxes are organized, you know, if it really push came to shove and you needed to go to court to someone, right? I think their service provider saying that their number at the time claimed they got the $500 is something, you know, your lawyer would be very interested in seeing. So I don't think, I think it's still useful, but. So I think we have Ben, then Chris.
I was just going to mention that connects kind of to a previous discussion we'd had about messaging from things that don't look like phone numbers from the from header. I think that's still currently out of scope because we're STIR and we do phone numbers, but it's something to think about in the long run.
Yeah, it's certainly not in the scope of 8224, right? Like it's just 8226 and all the things derived from it. I think what we want to avoid is conflating this discussion with a much broader discussion about WhatsApp, and well, maybe WhatsApp is a bad example, but any over-the-top messaging that is, you know, that does not rely on telephone numbers. I guess WhatsApp's a bad example of that. But Chris.
Quick note on non-repudiation. I think we've sort of had that philosophical discussion. You know, if I have a desk phone sitting and somebody else comes and picks it up and makes a illegal call on it, you know, that sort of encapsulates the bounds of what non-repudiation are. Like if it really is more about like who is authenticated with that. But I think we're going. I didn't want to go too far down that rat hole, but like I think that is important too.
I mean, yeah, with
with
all the with all the SIP brandy in the world, like your phone can still have a speaker and like be, you know, connected to another phone and like is proxying your text off to somebody else near another wiser, right? Like that's been a perennial problem with all these security systems. Robert.
Yeah, I just wanted to call back to a comment you made in an earlier presentation about choosing to do something different when you got a call from your bank that was not verified the same way it was, or as well as it was the last time you got a call from your bank, and getting you to just run that through your head in the messaging context.
No, I was thinking that as well. In that forensics case, you know, if somebody wants to try to deny, well, look, my number changed. Like if I've got like 100 text messages from you this month, you know, I think your argument gets a little bit weaker if you want to try to say, you know, oh my God, like that wasn't me. Okay. I think we've talked about expiry thresholds enough for one session. So I did also add a little bit of text, Ben, based on your comment about CPIM metadata that basically just points to your RFC, to RFC 8946, and to what you say in that about the potential modifications to CPIM metadata as calls are in transit, and did a little bit more general wordsmithing. Yes, Ben, CPIM metadata.
I was just going to say that I think what you put in on CPIM metadata is correct. It's the right thing to say in this document, specifically the idea that if you want to do something different, write your own profile.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so next slide. I think we're done.
Oh,
with this.
And by the way, I did read this draft.
Okay. They're all short. These aren't, you know, NFS v4 drafts or something. Next slide. Yeah, so we're still holding our shield wall against having conferencing be in scope of this document, but it doesn't mean I don't want it to actually work at some time in the future. So I did chat a bit with Richard Barnes about MLS and what the potential MLS interaction with this would look like. And after we went round and round and round in this, I think the conclusion we came to is actually we need to find what MLS means for like SIP. And once we did that, we could figure out like how to sign it for STIR. We think that would probably need its own working group. That might be a working group worth doing, actually, for a number of reasons. But like my pitch is here, let's not wait for that. Ben.
So there was just some discussion about forming something, and I can't remember the details, about forming something about applying MLS to specific messaging frameworks. And I don't know where that ended up. I wonder if anyone else did.
I can't say I'm super following MLS. I mean, that does ring a bell, but I don't know what came of that. Any other thoughts on this one? So basically, that's another me saying, let's punt.
Yes.
Chris.
Well, for practical purposes, I think, you know, the state of group messaging for MMS is pretty messy. Maybe RCS has some better things there. I don't know. I'm not as intimately familiar with that, but I think if you want to have trust across groups, I think we do need to consider something new. So I think that this is the right stance.
Okay. Next ding slide. I think this is in pretty good shape, actually. Next slide, still not showing up for me. I think all that slide is going to say is like, I think this is in pretty good shape and we should declare victory. Like, I don't think we want to say a lot more. I think we want to get this out into the marketplace and, you know, be able to tell people, no, there is a story for doing messaging with STIR, and this is the story, and see if anybody bites. Anybody think that this needs some course correction? We should rethink everything, do something totally different? If not, I think we should probably look to working group last call this fairly soon. Ben.
Comment that I have read this one, and I think this is probably pretty close to ready to working group last call. We've been through several versions, and you've incorporated comments, and I think the last round mine were the only comments.
Yeah.
So I would think, as an individual,
say,
once people have a chance to read this, then it's probably ready for working group last call.
Yeah, I was going to say your only other comment was about the OOB stuff, but I thought the existing text around OOB like was okay, and like that didn't require any specific correction. So if there's anything more narrow with that text that you want to add, because I don't think we want to be real prescriptive about it, but like if there's something specific that you want to like wordsmith about that, just so we know what it is.
I'll relook at it, but I think it was okay. I mean, I have some thoughts about how we might want to apply OOB to specific non-SIP type messaging environments, but that wouldn't be in scope for this draft. I don't think that would be a separate thing. It might not even be IETF.
No, I think it would have to be in 3GPP or wherever if it's going to be a 3GPP thing, right? So, like, those guys, they're protective of their stuff.
So maybe the answer is let's do working group last call now to get everybody reading it.
Works for me.
I had
Anyone
one other
object
quick
to
comment.
that? I'm sorry, Ben, we stepped on each other.
No, go ahead and call for objections. I had a separate comment.
Does anyone object to us starting working group last call in the next couple days? Okay.
I was going to make a quick callback to the previous comment about MLS. There was something in dispatch on applying MLS. So anyone who's interested, go back and look at that. I don't remember the details. I just got a message from Robert offline that was IMMI.
Was this Rowan's thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. I couldn't figure out what the hell he was trying to say, but that would not be the first time I've said that about Rowan May. Oh my God, this must be getting late in the hour. What do we have next? What's our next draft?
We are now up to the any other business, so your OCSP and short-lived.
Fantastic. A new deck is being shared. think that'll be my name in the bad attitude channel next time. Okay, there are some documents, believe it or not, that have existed for a very long time. Next slide that I'm going to talk about today. So, this presentation is a bit of a rerun from IETF 98. I think the last revision to the OCSP draft was in 2017. And that, just not to terrify any of you, that was 5 years ago now. And this was really based on, as Russ pointed out, going back into the archaeological record, we had some text about OCSP originally in RFC 8226, and we split it out into a separate draft because we felt like this could be work. If we felt like doing later, we could figure out why we wanted to do it and do it then. And I guess what I'm here to suggest today is there may be a reason to actually do this now. And, I revived both this and my old short-lived certs draft for a very specific reason that has to do with using TN-auth lists with telephone numbers in them and not service provider codes. Obviously, the majority of deployment thus far for STIR has been focused on SPCs. The issue is with the advent of certificate delegation, people are seriously starting to look at the question of, okay, how do you issue a certificate with a TN-auth list that is full of telephone numbers? And, our traditional party line for this has been, and was even in 8226, that complex certificates with telephone numbers probably want to have those telephone numbers included by reference rather than by value. What do I mean by that? Instead of having this big OID TN-auth list that lists like every single telephone number that, say, an enterprise is responsible for, even broken up into ranges, it could still be quite complex and dynamic. Dynamic to the point where you have to reissue the cert like every 2 hours if things about the number inventory change and those thresholds, which is just a hassle for everyone and isn't worth doing. We defined in 8226 a way to use the authority information access to include a URI in the certificate that points to where that TN-auth list lives somewhere on the web. So in other words, the cert itself would not have a TN-auth list with all this stuff in it. It would just have like an extension that has a URL in it in the AIA that points off to here's where you can download that TN-auth list object. We knew at the time, though, that this was a problem. And why don't I go to the next slide? The big problem is the bottom bullet there, that what you really don't want to do is have to download that entire list if you're a line party, like every time that you're accessing this. And Ben, do you have your hand up now? Should I have you come in now, or? You do not have your hand up now, okay. Rather than having people download the entire TN-auth list as relying parties, like whenever they need to rely on their certificate, effectively, they need to look at the freshest available copy of it. Why don't we define an OCSP extension that effectively just means, is this number that I'm asking about in this OCSP query within the scope of this certificate or not? And, I guess one more bit of history about this, just by way of explanation. When we started looking at OCSP and certificate freshness, we really were thinking, how to do this broadly in an environment like STIR-shaken. Should there be CRLs, or should there be OCSP, or should we be using like SCVP or whatever? And it was kind of like a beauty contest between these options. And that certainly is not what we're talking about now. We're not talking about changing anything about the way that people use CRLs for the vast majority of the SPC certificates that are out there. This is all about, should we have an OCSP option specific to the by reference case, and thus more or less specific to certificate delegation, where, as they say in Addis, an SCA, any certificate authority that is, delegating certificates down to enterprises or whatever, would run an OCSP interface that people could query to ask the simple question, is the calling party number of the passport I got in the scope of the certificate that signed it right now? Now, there are two ways to skin this cat, at least. There's probably, unfortunately, like 17. There are two that are in drafts at the moment. One is what I just described, doing this with OCSP. The other is to use short-lived certs. In other words, to basically generate a certificate, possibly on a per TN basis, maybe for a range, maybe for individual TNs, that is going to expire very rapidly, that like enterprises can use Acme or some of their dynamic protocol to be able to ingest these certs and then use them to sign calls, so that, again, it's unambiguous to relying parties whether or not the telephone number that it appears in the calling party number is within the scope of authority of the cert or not. Do people understand the problem? Am I explaining this well enough? Do people get kind of why I'm now focused on this? Because really, as we're kicking the tires on certificate delegation and doing TN auth lists potentially by ref, these kinds of questions come up pretty quick. Like, how do you actually practically do this if you have a large and complex TN auth list? Nobody lost? Okay. Jack, are you lost? Russ, are you lost? Jack first.
So I guess the question is, what's wrong with by reference? Because
the things people think are wrong with by reference are twofold. One, that the thing you're downloading could be big, could be really big, and that you need to download it basically every time you're going to rely on the cert. Every time I call, basically, with an X5 view of that cert is in front of your VS. Two, and this is maybe the more sensitive one, some people seem cagey about dispersing lists of every number that they own through an interface like this. Remember, like, your cert's going to live out in NestICR, where like anybody can grab it, and then anybody can look at the AIA and look at that URL and like download your entire TNOP list. Like, I gather some people are cagey about the idea that they're just going to reveal like what their entire telephone number inventory is.
Yeah, so I guess the reason that I can't really comment on the KG about what TNs you own, but the fact that they're big, I kind of see as a good thing, because in general, from like when we've deployed this, we just don't have time to make any requests out to the internet. We can't even usually download the certificate in the time span that we're meant to like be able to verify these passports. So we have to cache everything. And so having a large, like, by ref, just here's a dump of all the certificate, all the TNs, is incredibly useful because you can cache it.
I mean, of course, the question is, what really are the expiry semantics of that URL, and like how long can you cache it for if the list is very dynamic? If you have to like download it all the time, that doesn't help.
But it's better than having to definitely make a request on every single verification, or for every single passport.
And and when we get into this, OCSP has this thing called stapling. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So there are corners you cut if you actually are going to go down the OCSP path that we'll get into that can mitigate some of that. But who was first, Russ or Alec? I don't remember.
I think it was me. So in a shaken environment, you could have a certificate that only has an SPC. And so is the question being asked, has the TN moved out from under this SPC to somewhere else? Or are you asking something else? I guess I'm trying to ask the bigger picture.
Yeah, so we're talking about certificates that were delegated down from an intermediate cert held by one of those shaken providers, effectively, right? Let's just assume we're talking about North America exclusively, which we're not, but it'll be happier if we, easier if we do it that way for now. Just assume a shaken provider with an SPC has an intermediate cert, right, and has an SCA, and they're issuing delegate certs down to an enterprise. Now, as you may know, like, potentially there could be like multiple donors of like, SPCs that are donating different numbers to the blocks of that like individual enterprise's cert. We'll gloss over that for the moment as well. But just assume that like, the enterprise wants to have the number ranges for which it is responsible be what is expressed by its delegate cert. We're talking about using OCSP exclusively for the validation of those delegate certs. Does that help, Russ?
And just a time warning, we're down to 9 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we're not going to have enough time, but that's okay. Alec.
So I guess, yeah, I think you kind of said this to Jack's comment, but I think one of the big problems with the by reference is, yeah, what's the expiration on it? I mean, you're caching it, and then how long do you cache it for? And that can be a problem. I think one thing, just a comment. I mean, I think the OCSP use case, I think that's useful outside of just TN by reference. Just whether it's TN by reference, by value, either way. I mean, the only reason I say that is OCSP stapling. I think personally, I think we should require OCSP stapling. There's no OCSP without OCSP stapling in this environment, and maybe a header in the passport that has your staple. I mean, that alleviates that round trip. And when we're talking the delegate model, at least what's been done in the IETF, you can put a CRL, and the terminating provider doesn't know it until they go to get it, until they get the passport. So you've now forced them to do 2 round trips versus the current model, which is 1 round trip. And they're sequential round trips because you don't know the URL until you go get the certificate to do this CRL check. So OCSP stapling allows you to do all that revocation without having to do 2 checks. It works for, it can work for any use case of any certificate.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down, Alec, just to anticipate my own argument here, to where do we fall between OCSP stapling and short-lived? Or like, really, what is the practical difference between them? Like, and that's where this gets, I think, pretty interesting, because one thing we don't have is a way to convey OCSP stapling now. And I'm not sure if it would actually be in the passport. I think it would probably need to be in a SIP header. But why don't we fast forward 2 slides? Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, we should recommend stapling, but I think we would need to recommend where in the request we want that staple to live. And like, when we, part of the thing I'm trying to pose here, and I'm struggling to figure out how to do this in less than 7 minutes. I guess what I'm trying to up level to here is, I think, especially because of the use case of by ref, there are now people asking questions that are only going to have answers in this solution space, right? Something like OCSP with stapling or short-lived certs. And my pitch here basically is we need to work on one or both of these to satisfy what I see as an emerging request from the market that we anticipated a long time ago. Like, it's not that we didn't know this was coming down the pike. It's just it hasn't been urgent until suddenly, like, TN by ref because of delegation is becoming a thing. And it may have applicability beyond it, but that is, from what I see, the motivating use case to like really return to this. And we're not going to solve in this call like whether stapling or short-lived is like a better approach to this. Why don't we just go next slide? Next slide, keep going. I'm going to show people pictures and thing. I'm going to keep going. Oh my God. It's like a half-hour presentation. Just, in fact, keep going still. Obviously, the pitch for short-lived is that you use Acme, and especially like Acme Star and things like that. Now, if Acme had more practical deployment as a protocol people are using to acquire certificates for STIR-shaken, I would feel more optimistic about that. The fact that, people are using tokens, authority tokens, right, really in the absence of all of the protocol machinery of Acme for the most part, does not make me as optimistic for this as I was 5 years ago, that this was like a practical path. But I think it doesn't change the fact, because especially I'm not sure Acme is going to be used much anyway between SCAs and enterprises. The way that enterprises get certs, I suspect, will be automated. and won't necessarily look like Acme, but like has the potential to actually leverage those short-lived certs, means I think there is a path to that nonetheless. So next slide. And keep going after this too. Oh my God, 5 minutes left. Okay, this is where we want to get to. So like my pitch is, let's explore both of these a bit. We could probably have a whole interim, or at least just an informal call with the chickens here who care, right? Like to figure out like how much we think needs to be fleshed out of one or both of these. I don't think there's much harm in kicking the tires on both and kind of figuring out what the path is. I've also heard some people pitching kludges, right, that are gonna try to accomplish some of this with like HTTP semantics and X5U and things like that. Like there's a bunch of different ways to potentially skin this. I think what we may ultimately need actually is like a requirements phase of this that we're then going to be able to compare these solutions to. It could be as well, and certainly cognizant, short-lived certs can coexist with any approach that we choose here for this, right? And like it's certainly not going to be very intrusive to the overall operations of STIR-Shaken to do it, except for upfront costs you're paying not at call setup time in order to get live, fresh, short-lived certs. So I mean, it may not be that we even need to resolve a BD contest, but I think we need to look at this because the need for it is real. And this is just a chicken that has come home to roost in terms of something that we gotta attack at this point. So anybody else on this call feel like this is worth attacking, would like to join in and do some work on this and try to get this resolved? Or does anybody think that we should totally ignore this? And happy to get that feedback too. Chris.
I just put a note in the chat, but I'm supportive of looking at both and potentially utilizing both.
Yeah, awesome. Actually, yeah, Alec.
Same.
Okay.
Supportive of both.
All right, well, let's find some time when we can get together and talk through what we think the potential features are, what the mature version of these looks like. Because again, most of the stuff that's in this draft, I kicked it a bit to explain the BIREF problem in particular on both the drafts, but a lot of this text has, got whiskers on it. It's so old. So, I mean, I think we really need to take a harder look at where Acme is and if we think it's feasible for short-lived, or if we want to specify some kind of alternative interface for that, or if we want to punt that to the marketplace, what the interface should be between an SDA and an enterprise. But it's pretty clear to me this work has got to be done. With that, I suggest that we declare victory for today. My voice is getting hoarse here.
Okay, so clearly more discussion is needed on these topics. Hopefully we'll see some of that on the mail list. The two drafts are already out there, so take a look, see what John's thinking about. Any last moments? We have about a minute left. Okay, so expect to see one working group last call for messaging in the next couple days. And then when the versions get posted for identity header errors and service provider OOB, after the next version of each of those appears, we'll do a working group last call for those. Thank you for your participation and have a very nice day.
Take care.